It's 8 o'clock.
And the fact that she
Good morning. I call the December 2019 meeting of the Governance and Policy Committee to order. At this time, we have a 2-hour meeting scheduled. There's nothing wrong if it ends a little early. No one will object, I'm sure. But on the assumption that the meeting is going to go 2 hours, my intention is to divide it. We have 2 items on the agenda. One is our draft of the Board of Regents Policy Code of Conduct for members of the Board of Regents for our review. And the second item is the policy framework for renamings, which involves a discussion with President Gable. My intention is to divide these 2 topics into 60-minute pieces, so 60 minutes for the review of the draft code, and then 60 minutes to address the policy framework for renamings. Let's move right then to the code of conduct, if we could. In the materials, all of you had the opportunity, I hope, to review the redraft of, or actually the draft of the code of conduct. This is the first time you've actually had an opportunity to see the language that we hope reflects the discussion that has taken place over many sessions, including the last one that we had in October. And you also have in front of you, with that, the work that the Board of Regents office prepared to explain where certain provisions came from other policies that we have and where there was new language inserted to reflect hopefully what is the consensus of the committee. So my intention to go through this is to go through the entire policy, and given the numerous provisions that are contained in it, and in looking at it with the board office, I think the best way to proceed is that we will group our discussion. There are some items that I think we can get through more quickly and that we can group talk about as a group, and there are other sections where we will just devote our time to that particular section to get your reaction. The whole purpose of this exercise now is for you to react to the language that we have set down or has been set down in this draft code. If you've got issues, edits, questions, to raise them. Obviously, we've got people from the board office that hopefully will be able to answer questions as well regarding what we've done in the past. But this is the time, if you want to make suggestions on the language, this is the time we want to hear it. I'd also remind you that you have in front of you a draft resolution. This is not a resolution we are taking up today, but rather this is the draft of the resolution that we will presumably entertain at our February meeting when we actually act on what will hopefully be the final version of the policy. So with that, if all of you could make sure that you've got your code of conduct in front of you, the draft. What I'd like to do is group sections 1 and 2, section 1 having to do with the scope, section 2 having to do with the guiding principles, and ask if there are any reactions, comments, edits to the language that is set forth. All right. Hearing none, I'm going to, and just so you know, interpret that we can go with this language. And if just so you know what I'm interpreting your silence as and that's perfectly fine, that means we've done our work. The next section then to address, I would like to address is section 3, which is the fiduciary duty section. We'll just take a look at that section without any other sections in mind. And again, I would like to get your reaction and edits to that. Let me just make one comment about that particular section. I raised with all of you after this came out in the materials, I sent to you all a draft of it wasn't a draft, it was a statement by the AGB, the American Governing Board, having to do with their comments and study on these issues. And I noticed that they talked about confidentiality being an issue that could come up under fiduciary duties, and that it was something that we had not raised or ever really talked about in any of the discussions in the past. And so I indicated that I would welcome any input on that topic. I want to make sure, I'm happy to get input, and I'm more inclined actually to have us walk through this policy as written, and then at the end, if there is time to address your thinking on the issue of confidentiality. I have had a discussion since I sent that out with Doug Peterson about this and whether this is even feasible to address confidentiality, given we are subject to a variety of statutes that govern the issue of what we can do, the open meeting laws, Data Privacy Act, et cetera. So, and the AGB statement actually recognized that there may be special issues if you have open meeting laws or laws that bear on it. So I don't want to take the time right now to dwell on confidentiality. I'd rather return to it at the end and have us react at this point to the proposed language having to do with fiduciary duties. So with that, those comments in mind, I'm opening up for discussion, any reaction, edits, proposed changes.
This is on section 3?
Section 3 of the draft code that addresses the duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. Wonderful. Hearing none.
I think she's going through the sections. Have a comment.
So this is the time, if, just to be clear, if you've got issues with this particular section, comments, edits, anything you want to say, this is the time to raise that issue while we have that section before us.
And Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes.
So you're going to come back to the confidentiality conversation?
I'd like to, because I'd like to go through what everybody did have the benefit of in writing, and then we can loop back to the issue of confidentiality. Regent Hsu.
Yes, general concern that I've had, I don't know if this is the right section for it. I'm sure you'll tell me. But when we have regents sitting on other boards related to the university, I think there's always a concern of what hat you're wearing at a particular time. I wonder if that's something that we need to address as under duty of loyalty, maybe.
It does, just as a Regent Hsu, thank you for your comment. Let me just say that under the duty of loyalty section in the third sentence, it says when regents sit on boards of associated organizations as defined by the Board of Regents policy, associated organizations, and outlined in the Board of Regents policy, appointments of organizations and boards, their ultimate duty of loyalty is to the university. So let me just say that that language was put in there to address the concern that you've just raised. And so my question to you is, when you look at that language, does that address the concern that you have raised, or do you have other comments or suggestions with regard to it?
Oh, I think, and I appreciate the fact that it's in there now. I think it's a good start. I need to think a little bit more about whether or not that fully addresses the concerns.
Okay. Yes, Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's the one area that I had, particularly in this section. I don't know that I can really wrap my head around the concept that we can just simply ipse dixit that the loyalty is here, because, and I don't know if this is a general counsel type question, but this demonstrates the challenge with having people serve as a voting board member on multiple boards. We just declare that their loyalty is to us, and then it's okay. But they still have a fiduciary duty if they're serving on another board. And so we can't vacate their obligation of loyalty to that board as well. Otherwise, we could say, we want to sell, or we want to buy $5 million of widgets from Acme Corporation. Well, Regent Smith is also on the board of Acme Corporation, but we'll just declare that Regent Smith's loyalty is to the university, and then it's okay. There's that continuing conflict. If you have the fiduciary duty as a board member, another board can't just simply say, but your duty is greater to us, because that would obviate the loyalty issue for the other body. And so it would strike me that we either have to avoid those kinds of conflicts of loyalties, which is the exact title for that conflict, or we would have to create some kind of recusal circumstance when we're doing business with these other entities. Now, I've spoken with the general counsel on this matter, and would certainly invite him to approach the dais or the desk.
General Counsel Peterson, you're coming to the stand here. I appreciate that.
But yeah, just simply to say that this is also in the context of what I seem to perceive as a difference of opinion between that relationship with the university and the independence of the associated entities, which we probably don't need to get into right now, but certainly bears on the challenge with the conflict of loyalties. So, Madam Chair, I would return it to you for
All right.
comment from Ms.
General Counsel Peterson, if you could share with us your thoughts on this issue.
Chair Miron, Regent Rocha, the governance question you raise is a key issue for people who are kind of wearing a couple of hats, and as you point out, will carry fiduciary responsibilities to each organization in some way, and how do you reconcile that? I believe the language that's proposed is the appropriate guidance in terms of regents serving on other boards within their regent capacity. And maybe the best way I can articulate the way that we try to navigate that territory is to make sure that it's clear to the other organization that when regents or university representatives serve on those boards, that their ultimate responsibility to the university is not deemed a breach of their fiduciary duty to the other organization. An example would be we don't have regents, but we have university representatives on the Fairview board, another sort of nonprofit entity, but embedded in their bylaws and additionally communicated by us to Fairview is the concept that they appreciate that those people are serving in a representative capacity, if you will, and that to Fairview recognizes that those representatives articulating and advocating for the university position and voting a position that's in the interest of the university is not a breach of the fiduciary duty of the other organization. In fact, it's the reason why they're on that board is to serve as a proxy or as a spokesperson for one of the key constituents of that organization. So, but those ways of navigating those dual responsibilities need to be very clear and transparent from the start for governance purposes. Otherwise, everybody walks into the very issue you're talking about.
Regent Rocha, excuse me.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Sometimes it's hard to know where one of us ends. And thank you, Mr. Peterson. That's foreign to me. I mean, but what was really key, I think, in what you said is the representative component. And the way maybe it's too simplistic, but I think it's pretty accurate for how the literature and the world treats the issue is you should never have to wonder which hat someone's wearing at the time that you're having a discussion or taking a vote. This year as chair of audit, I've been asked to serve on the audit committee of the foundation, which I very much appreciate having a seat at that table, and I'm very impressed with their operation, and I'm pleased to provide input from the board side to the extent that I'm able, and then using that to relay the perspectives back to the board. I don't think I need a vote. I would really prefer to be the board's representative and to be able to provide that sort of more of as a liaison as opposed to a fiduciary. I'm not really clear on what, I don't feel like I'm a fiduciary of the foundation, even though I'm a member of this audit committee, and so I'm still trying to understand that. And it would seem to me that in this situation, I have great faith that if we had people who were representatives to these entities on behalf of the board, but not fiduciary voting members of these boards, they would attend, faithfully, and that they would represent the board's position. But there'd be no question in my mind or anyone else's that they are members of the board, and their loyalty would be to our, to the Board of Regents and the university. that's my position. Obviously it's a board of 12, so we'd have to kind of figure out how to go there. But that seemed, if we were in a very small town with very few people, sometimes you'd have no choice but to have some of these overlaps. But we're in a community of many, many talented people, and I think that we can have members of these boards that don't overlap to create these questions about what hat someone's wearing when they're acting in which capacity. Thank you.
Let me just make a comment then before General Counsel Peterson responds, and we do have at least one other board member who would like to also weigh in on this. I take it, my understanding is that we have board members, regents, who sit on some affiliated boards and vote, and some regents who sit on affiliated organizations and don't vote. Is that correct, General Counsel Peterson?
Yes, Chair Maron.
And does your analysis then for that seems to be the point that Regent Rocha is making here, that he gets it if he's a non-voting member, but his issue rises if the regent is a voting member on one of these affiliated organizations. Assuming both organizations recognize that what the university is saying is, we're on this board, voting or non-voting, you need to know our ultimate duty of loyalty will always be to the university when we talk about fiduciary duties. Does that change your analysis if it's a voting or non-voting regent?
Chair Maron, it's a factor. It certainly adjusts the thermostat in terms of the potential for tension, but that distinction is not a light switch for me in terms of turning this issue on and off. One consideration is whether or not the related organization in its governance documents recognizes that it is consistent with the fiduciary duties of a regent board member to advocate on behalf of the university and ultimately place the university first in their voting capacity. So that's one governance mechanism, if you will, to reconcile those considerations. In the case of the foundation, and reasonable minds are going to differ here, but from my point of view, that organization is entwined in the mission of the University of Minnesota, that it is a creation, affiliated body that has a memorandum of understanding with the Board of Regents, but in many ways is an arm of the Board of Regents. And so as a result, it's difficult for me to envision a situation in which a regent sitting in some capacity with the foundation by voting with the university hat on is somehow going to be acting inconsistent with the fiduciary responsibilities of someone who's a board member of the University of Minnesota Foundation, because to me their mission is to serve and benefit the University of Minnesota. And so given that that's the charter mission of that foundation, for a regent to be in practice voicing what is clearly in the university's interest, to me, I'm just hard pressed to imagine a practical circumstance where that's not also in the interest of that foundation, even though other foundation members may kind of come to a different conclusion on a particular topic, but it won't be that as a governance matter, a regent acting in the university's interest will somehow be in conflict with their fiduciary responsibilities to that foundation.
All right.
May I respond, Madam Chair?
Just briefly, and then I do want to move on because we have other comments and we've got other sections. So I think we're fleshing out the issue here, and I think it's important to hear how others are weighing in on it.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chair. Two comments real quickly. The first one is that where part of my concern arises is that you and I have had this conversation and you've made that same point. And in my conversations with the foundation, there seems to be a bit of a difference in the perception of the independence or the intertwining nature of the relationship. And I think that's something that this board needs to consider and address. But the second part is, it's not hard for me to conceive. Because to some extent, it's not just, obviously reasonable minds can disagree on a specific item and whether it's in the university's best interest, or if another path would be in the university's best interest. But there are also dynamics about where control remains with respect to matters of significant importance to the university. And for this board and its constitutional underpinnings to ensure that it maintains that position to be the entity that ultimately decides what is in the interest of the university, you could have those kinds of conflicts. And so to the extent that these organizations would have something, as you described, that makes very clear where the duty of loyalty is and it's understood in their operations, that, again, it's not a light switch, but it gets me closer to the on button, I think. But to the same extent, if we say the duty of loyalty in this language belongs to the university, and they have language that says the duty of loyalty belongs to, Help the World, Inc., organization, whatever, we run into an issue in which language controls. So I think this is an important conversation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Mayor. This is I want to call this a great discussion. It's a hard issue, but it is a good one. And Regent Rocha, you and I, over the last several years, have bumped into this many times and had really good conversation about it. I think that, and I got a question for Mr. Steves that maybe he can think about, and then I'll throw my 2 cents in here. But is this brand new, or was there ever anything like this that created what I will call a hierarchy of duties? Did this ever? I don't remember this before. Anything like it anywhere in the code. Is it brand new?
Madam Chair, Regent McMillan, this is new language specifically intended to address this issue.
That's what I thought. I just didn't go back and do the homework to make sure. So with that in mind, I think we're taking a step down a continuum to add a hierarchical principle, but it doesn't address everything. And to me, the next step, I wouldn't want to go all the way to the end of that hierarchy and say we always want a representational role on those boards, because I think we're giving something up then. But the governing documents of the affiliated organization are critical. And you just laid it out 35 seconds ago when you said, if there's competing duties, simply stating the hierarchy here doesn't eliminate the problem. But I think if we look at those, especially the most important affiliated organizations, things like Fairview and the Foundation, we can probably get to the bottom of that once we've stated what the hierarchy has to be. The fact that we didn't have one before, I think, was open ground for trouble. And now that we're at least moving down that continuum, I appreciate the representational thing, but I just would hate to give that vote up to completely insulate this potential. I'd rather get into their documents and say, boy, is there trouble here or potential trouble? Good discussion, though, really good.
Just a quick question for General Counsel Peterson. Do you know, for example, if the foundation's whatever papers they have, or the memo of understanding, or the Fairview board addresses this hierarchical issue? In other words, recognizes that the university's representatives' ultimate duty of loyalty will be to the university, and they're not in breach of loyalty to the affiliated organization?
Chair Mayor, and as I indicated, there is a discussion of this in the Fairview charter documents. With regard to the foundation, we're back to its charter mission and its entwinement in both Board of Regents policy and through its memorandum of understanding. And I differentiate a difference of opinion as to a tack that an organization takes from whether or not a person that serves on both the board, this board and the foundation board, whether that's a breach of fiduciary duty to be kind of advocating kind of the university perspective in terms of exercising those fiduciary duties. So that's the artful navigation of the territory that's much easier in the foundation context, given its stated charter mission to serve and benefit the University of Minnesota. That paves the way for a regent member to be speaking with the university's voice and be acting consistent with the foundation's charter mission by definition. whereas with Fairview, it's more important that it's stated in some fashion in their charter documents, which it is.
Thank you. Regent Beeson?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for advancing it. It is a good discussion. I would say, just stepping back, it should be infrequent when we have people acting in their official capacities being on other boards. And it is, and we don't have many right now. We've got just several, right? So as a practice, I don't think this is an area we want to encourage. And I would also say that it's more important to have contract language with these partners. So with Fairview, we've got now a very detailed memorandum agreement. And I think that protects the university's interests more than having a minority of board people. You know, a minority of board people gets us at the table, whether they're voting or not voting. But there's no substitute for good contract language. And so let's not forget about that. The foundation, I'm a little less concerned about because they are so closely entwined. We are separate, but we're so related. I would say that's very different than the Fairview situation. And again, beyond that, I would be, well, we're going to have, if we start up East Gateway, we've got the visas where, in there we're a partner. So we're talking about something a little different there about having, well, we're going to have board people on that if we move ahead. But I think each one's got to be looked at individually then.
And let me ask Regent Beeson, so looking at the language which is new, are you comfortable with the current language as it is stated here? Or not, or?
Madam Chair, I would say
delete it or what?
I mean, I would be open to amended language too, but I'm okay, I think, with, it's hard to write in this policy to deal with every one of our partnership and engagements, I guess that would be. But I'm listening to what I'm hearing and I'm open.
Any further comments on this? We're going to need to move on. I do see Regent Rocha, your hand is up here, so, but let me see if any of the other regents have any comments on this before we move on.
No one does.
Oh, yes, well, I guess Regent Rocha, given you've already, you've already spoken, Regent McMillan, so I'll let Regent Rocha and then I'll let Regent McMillan, you'll have the last say and we'll move on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just building off of your question to Regent Beeson, my response to that would be maybe incorporating a bit of what General Counsel stated a minute ago, where duty, if serving on these boards, something along the lines of the duty that recognizes that they recognize that the duty of loyalty is with the board. That we can get to that point, but you need to have that clarification. We can't just sort of, again, say it unilaterally. It would have to be something where we say it and they recognize it in order for that to work, something like that. I don't have an example right now, but we could craft that perhaps.
All right, thank you. And then Regent McMillan.
I think that it might be helpful between now and February for the foundation discussion, and it's going to get furthered later on in our meeting, this morning, this whole issue. But we want to be on a very high plane with them where we trust one another, and we should probably dig into what that governing document, so the whole 12 of us understand it. And then there might also be value to having the board office put together some kind of a little catalog of what the affiliated organizations are and who sits on them. I don't even know, like I sit on the Carlson Supporting Organization Board, which is clearly only exists to help support the Carlson School. It was set up as a trust that way, and then a little bit of money comes off that, and we help Shreeza here come up with ways to spend it. So there's no doubt about it, but I don't think anybody, I don't know if anybody even knows I'm on it. So it'd be helpful for, I think, the full board to know what those are, number one, all of the organizations, and number two, which members of this board sit on. Catalog, something like that.
I think we have, the board office has something to that extent and could certainly make it available as part of our continuation on this topic.
Helpful.
All right. Thank you. Let's move on then to, I'm going to group sections 4 through 7 together. This is the definitional section, the financial disclosure section, the gift section, and the expenses section. And my question is, any changes, edits, questions, et cetera? Yes, Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair. Chair Mayron. So on subdivision 4 of section 4, financial interest, is non-trivial financial effect a term of art that is widely understood? Or if it is, then I'm okay with it. But it just seems to lack definition. And should we specify? Should we be a little more deliberate in defining what a non-trivial financial effect, what that is or what it might be?
First of all, let me ask Mr. Steves. I'm looking at the explanation here that you provided to us, that the board office provided. Subdivision 4, financial interest includes current language from section 5, subdivision 5 of the Code of Ethics. So that may answer Regent Powell's question. It may not, as to whether that language was new language or non-trivial financial effect, or whether it came from an older version. And it may be then, again, we may need some assistance from General Counsel Peterson as to whether he has any information about whether that's language that's often used to address the issue of what's a financial interest.
Madam Chair, this is existing language that was carried over into this policy for this definition. That said, there's nothing that would prohibit the committee from further defining what it means by non-trivial financial effect. I know in other cases within this policy, I think there was something related to gifts where we've now defined a limit, of saying below $75 is, non-trivial or is trivial, and so not triggering this. Certainly in this case, you could set a dollar amount, or you could set some other standard by which this non-trivial financial effect could be measured.
Okay. Other comments with respect to either financial, well, first of all, let me ask Regent Powell, would that address the concern that you've raised about should we be defining what non-trivial means?
I think it might. It just struck me that it's an important definition, financial interest, that it appears that we then proceed really to not define it. And so I don't, but I could imagine that this would be a moving, over time, we'd come back to it and we might say, hey, look, in 2020, anything more than $200, I mean, but so I think that would tell us what we need to know. But I mean, I'm open to discuss it and don't want to get too hung up on it, but I think we ought to put some definition on it.
All right. Thank you. Regent Beeson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'm okay with it being undefined. The expectation is that if there's any question about whether it's a financial conflict of interest, the board member needs to recuse themselves. And I think that's so on almost any situation where a board member has got a financial interest in it. This goes to the financial interest of a board member benefiting from doing business with the university, I believe. Is that correct, Madam Chair?
Well,
where this begins to...
Where it plays itself out in answer to your question, Regent Beeson, is in Section 8, conflicts of interest, where we talk about when a conflict of interest may exist, and it talks about when a regent has a material, financial, or other personal interest is inconsistent with their duty of loyalty, or when a regent, and then it goes on, member, business associated with the regent or regent's family, has an actual or potential financial interest in a matter pending before the board that may impair a regent's independence of judgment or objectivity in the discharge of their responsibilities of the university, including a transaction or other action taken by the university. So the whole issue will get examined under the conflict of interest section as to whether the financial interest is rising to the level of a conflict, regardless of definition.
Mm-hmm. Madam Chair, I guess going back to when in doubt, a regent should bring it to the you know, to the chair, and, you know, or pass. Trivial's almost non-existent, right? So this is a very, it's a general comment, but it's very, to me, it's pretty clear.
Thank you. So are you suggesting maybe we could take out the word non-trivial and just say if it had a financial interest shall mean a foreseeable financial effect that may result from board action, and then this gets picked up under the conflict provision? Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Perhaps I guess I could go either way on keeping it in or not.
All right. Regent Shu?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I have the same question on the non-trivial thing. I think it should be defined or removed. Is, I guess, the simplest way of handling it. And then on a separate issue, the definition of family member.
In your issue there with respect to family member?
My issue there is, you know, we're including anyone residing in the Regents household, but then we're exempting, apparently by definition, you know, grandkids, or, you know, there's very few people here that would have grandkids and that could receive a benefit, but it is possible that a grandkid could receive a benefit. And, you know, there are some people here who may have grandparents who would still be living and could receive a benefit. So I just want to make sure that we're explicitly trying to exempting those generations from this policy.
Okay. Any other comments on the definitional, on sections 4 through 7? I first saw Regent Anderson, then we'll address Regent.
It was just brought to my attention, and I probably missed it in this section 4, subdivision 4, but non-trivial is just you know, it's a subjective term. I just think that term should be taken out of there. It does nothing. That's my one point.
All right. Regent Rocha?
Thank you.
And then we will address Regent Kenyatta, and then we will hopefully move on to the next sections.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Real quick, first, this is, you know, there are thousands of pages of case law trying to get at what these different words mean and what's relevant. Let me go in order on a couple things. When it talks about who has resided in, let's see, where was it again? No, residing in the regent's household during their term as regent, that becomes a little bit is that at the moment of the issue? Because you can take someone like Regent Beeson, who's been here for a decade, and he may have had somebody that was a house guest for a period, or a relative or friend 10 years ago, and they've been gone since then. That would be during arguably your term as regent. It seems like it maybe from a temporal standpoint, we should define it at the time or within a term. That seems a little bit broad to me. But the issue for me is when I look at this is it's, you know, could you say a material financial interest as opposed to non-trivial? But to me, it has more to do with whether it's direct, because you could have a direct issue where somebody is going to yield, you know, $75 from a decision because you have ownership of some asset that the university wants to acquire. But you could have an indirect circumstance where you're affecting the market because the university is purchasing securities or something. It's really, really hard to capture all of that with this language. So from that portion about the financial interest, I kind of go back to the default. It wasn't broke. At least we hadn't run into any issue. And so to the extent we can't necessarily make it a lot clearer, because even foreseeable is a subjective term, whether something was foreseeable based on a certain action. So I completely appreciate everything everybody's raising, but in the absence of being able to come up with something that's going to solve all of those issues, I tend to default to what we had, because it's up until this point hasn't demonstrated any shortcomings. The more important thing here, Madam Chair, is we may need to put some language in there, Mr. Peterson, about subject to the language of Section 3. because Section 4 right now is in conflict with Section 3. To the extent that it refers to to an organization, corporation, the affiliated organizations are organizations and corporations, and then it refers to serves as an officer. So you don't have to have a financial stake, you just simply have to serve as an officer under 1B. So I think in there we should say, subject to the exception.
I'm sorry, where are you now? Which section are you?
Under 4.1, subdivision 1 of Section 4.
All right.
A business associated with a regent shall
I see.
mean an organization, corporation. It doesn't exempt affiliated organizations as per Section 3. So we might need to have language that says, with the exception of the affiliated organizations as defined, et cetera, because this now kicks you out. That one lets you in, this one kicks you out. So we should say that other than those, it would be any organization, corporation on which you would serve as an officer or director.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Kenyatta, and then we'll move on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just going to comment on the point about financial interest and the term non-trivial. And yeah, I mean, I guess we're discussing one side of it, but the other flip side is what do we gain by having the word non-trivial? As in what trivial financial interest would we want to protect or allow someone to still be able to weigh in on? So I would err on just striking the term and going through the normal conflict process, which we'll discuss in the next section, where you disclose it to leadership and general counsel, and they determine if it's a conflict or not.
Okay, thank you very much. All right. Let's move on then to Section 8, which is the conflict of interest section. And we'll just take that one as a whole. And let me make sure I've got this. Yes, all the way through. Did I miss something here? It seems like we went from 8. Am I missing a 9 here, or it looks like it went from 8 to 10? And maybe I'm missing a.
Madam Chair, you just caught the typo that we inserted in there for you.
All right. There is no 9, so everybody can agree on that. So we'll just address right now Section 8. All right. Any issues, comments with respect to Section 8? Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Mayron. And so this comment has to do with subdivision 4, elected or appointed office, and you may have discussed this before at a meeting that I wasn't able to attend, and if so, and if this comment has already been discussed, apologies. But my comment is, or question is, we say that it looks to me like it's very much of a case by case policy that, for instance, if a regent is elected to a state office, that would go to the general counsel, and he or she whoever would offer an opinion on whether that represents a conflict of interest. And so I guess my question is, aren't there some elected offices that would clearly create, in all cases, a conflict of interest? So if Regent Beeson became a state senator and is now, on this, and we appeal to the legislature every 2 years for funding, isn't that a conflict of interest clearly? And if there are some that exist, state legislature as an example, shouldn't those be stated in here as conflicts? So if you become on the city council of Bloomington, I mean, you're probably not in a conflict situation. But in other words, it seems like there's some that are just by definition will be conflicts. And if you were elected to a state representative, you wouldn't be eligible to serve on this board because there's a clear conflict.
Okay. Regent Beeson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regent Paul, I had the same initial reaction that you did there, that there would be one position where it would be really non-negotiable in terms of a conflict, and that would be if someone were elected to the legislature. The old policy had it restricted board regents from having any public position, and I think that's passé now. So I would have less difficulty if somebody were elected from this, the Blooming. We had Regent Cohen was a member of the school board in the western suburbs, and that was not seen as a conflict. But as I talked to the chair about this, I think maybe broader language like this is better than sort of carving out specific sort of situations. And letting the board deal with each conflict as it arises rather than trying to memorialize it in the policy, I think is probably the way to go. But I do understand the most critical conflict would be if somebody's elected to the legislature, and is on this board at the same time. Now, we also talked about the issue of what happens if somebody gets an employment here, faculty or staff position, have one before or during their board, and we should talk about that too.
All right. Any other comments by any other regions? Oh, I'm sorry, Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, this is a really good conversation. I think I'm on the same wavelength with Regent Beeson on this, and that this broader language, I think, gives us a better place to start from. One of the terms that Regent Paul used that kind of jumped out at me was, you said would not be eligible to serve on this board. I don't know that there are broader authorities that dictate who is eligible, and what would happen if the state legislature elected one of their own to serve as a member. I don't see it happening. I think they'd be crazy to take on the additional task, but I'm not able to draw the line of the objective conflict in the same way. In fact, I would suggest that the conflict for them would really be their district would have to be concerned about them now having a loyalty to the university that may supersede their representation of their specific district. And because the legislature gives us money, we don't give them money, which would create, if we were funding the legislature, then there would, that would fall under other conflicts, I think. So I understand what you're saying. I appreciate what you're saying. I think of something like if the legislative auditor were elected to the board, there'd be a real issue about whether that person could exercise, his or her duties in that position. We haven't run into it, and so I would tend to prefer the broader language to let us address it when the issue comes up, just because I'd have a hard time coming up with an exhaustive list, and then you end up with the situation that if you say these, but you didn't say these, then these would be sort of presumptively okay, even though they may be a worse conflict than those that we enumerated. So I would tend to go with the language that will let us address, catch the ball as it comes to us, sort of thing. So thank you.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. I'd like to ask our board office, Mr. Steves, there was a comment made by Mr. Beeson as to what the prior policy provided, and I think that you may be able to lend some information about that.
Madam Chair, two clarifying points. One is related to university employment. Both the former policy and the current policy address that specifically and prohibit university employment by any member of the board, except for the person who holds the seat designated for a student at time of election, and they are allowed to hold student employment as defined by human resources. There's actually a definition of student employment, and so that point is addressed. The point about elected office is accurate, that the previous language said that upon running for or declaring for a partisan elective office, you shall resign from the board. And so it was very black and white, and also perhaps difficult to implement, in part because there's no such thing as a partisan office. You run for an office with maybe a partisan endorsement. So it had some flaws all on its own.
All right, anything further? Yes, Regent Kenyana.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this question is kind of a very narrow exception, but we're discussing it, so I might as well ask. And you and I discussed this to Mr. Steve's point about university employment, and that the only exception carved out is for the student or the regent holding the seat designated for a student. There could be a situation where there's another regent that's a student that isn't the student regent, either by a current regent deciding to re-enroll or or two students getting elected to the board, which, if I'm correct, has happened before, would that other regent that happens to be a student, but not the student, I think you follow, would they be allowed to hold employment?
Executive Director Steves?
Madam Chair, Regent Kenyanya, under this language, under the previous language and the language in this policy, no. That said, the board would always have the prerogative to revisit that situation should it arise. The fact of the matter is that most of the people, at least in recent times, who've been elected and been students at the time of election are moments away from graduation.
So I've heard.
All right, any further comments on this particular section? All right, hearing none then. Oh, I'm sorry, Regent Shu.
Thank you, Chairman Aaron. I'm just a little concerned about the language in subsection 4, where it says, if a conflict exists, either the board shall approve a plan for addressing the conflict or the regent shall resign from the board.
And this is the section under
Elected,
paragraphs.
yeah.
It's the second paragraph where if an
Yes,
individual
and-
has been elected or appointed to a public office other than the office of regent. Okay.
So, I mean, I see the way out if the board is going to approve a plan, but I also just think that the other aspects of this policy, including conflicts, should maybe just be employed instead of saying that if the plan isn't approved by the board, the regent shall resign. So I don't think our policy should be able to force someone to resign. If the board just decides not to approve the plan, then the regent wouldn't have to resign, according to this policy.
Can I speak to that, Madam Chair?
Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This goes back to some of this other conversation about how the board, there's this natural tension between our ability. Constitutionally, we set the law for the university, but we don't set the law for the state. And the state dictates how a person becomes a regent. And so, I think ultimately what you'll end up with, I agree with your concern on this, Regent Chu, and, could this be a backdoor way of expelling someone that would fall out of the graces of some number of other regents, simple majority or more? Because again, you could backdoor that discipline by virtue of saying, well, we think you have a conflict and we don't approve a plan, therefore you must resign. Bottom line is agencies outside of the university would ultimately be making those decisions. It would end up in the courts, I'm sure, at that point. So it comes back to the enforceability. Could we enforce, if the rest of the board determines someone has a conflict, and hopefully with a pure heart, and that person disagrees and does not choose to resign, I don't think this policy gives us, nor do I think we necessarily can establish a policy that gives us clarity on our ability to expel a member of this board, because those provisions are above us. Thank you.
And just again, a matter of clarification, Mr. Steves, that language actually came from the earlier policy having to do with, once you declare candidacy for a public office, you shall resign. So that was a carryover, is that correct?
Madam Chair, that's correct.
All right. All right, moving on to section 10. Any comments or edits with respect to section 10? All right, moving on. Oh, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't see. Regent Rocha.
Thank you. I'm trying to catch up here. This was I sent you an email regarding this language. I think this is good language. I think it respects, many considerations. I'm only concerned, and I don't have a copy of what I sent. I can dig it up through my email here. It would just take me a moment to catch up. But it talks about when necessary, the board chair or delegate will speak for the board on actions taken by the board. There are two parts of that, cutting in different vectors. The first one is that I think that's too limiting. I think the board chair can speak publicly on matters that have not yet necessarily had actions taken by the board, such as explaining to the public how the board will be addressing a matter, or, actions that are empowered to the chair and vice chair, such as we're going to bring in someone to address the concern and so on. To limit it exclusively to actions taken by the board, I think is too narrow for the expectations we have of the board chair. And particularly there may be times if the president is on an exotic hiking trip in the Andes and is not available, then the board chair may end up playing that role as well. The second part of it is, or delegate. I'm not comfortable with that language, only because I'd like to know who we're empowering to speak on behalf of, and I believe we delegate that to the chair, and in the chair's absence, the vice chair. So I'm not really sure what we mean by delegate, if we're the chair able to, sort of pick any person to speak on behalf of the board. I think as a board, we would want to be a little more specific about who that delegate might be. So I don't know how I gave you some language that I thought might sort of get there. Wasn't intended to be perfect, and I certainly have no ownership issues with it, but Mr. Steves, I think, has it.
I think Mr. Steves has located the language. Do you want to read what Mr. Rocha suggested?
Madam Chair, his suggestion was, quote, "The board chair or vice chair in the chair's absence is the spokesperson for the board on matters of public concern and may represent the position of the board when it has taken action on a matter. When necessary, the board chair or vice chair in the chair's absence will speak on behalf of the university."
Any other comments with respect to the section 10?
Madam Chair.
Other than the fact we'll renumber it and make it section 9. Yes, Regents, speak up.
Madam Chair, I don't think this is a concern or a conflict at all, but I just want to make the point that while an individual member may speak for him or herself, not for the board, the board chair needs to speak for the board, that there is never any potential conflict that arises because of misunderstanding that sometimes when we get quoted or a person from the press asks us for a comment, we may say we're speaking for ourselves, not for the board, but that's not always, might not be related in the article or in the TV article or the TV program or whatever. Just so that there's no misunderstanding that we speak for ourselves, even though it's not reported that way, doesn't mean we didn't put that disclaimer in there.
Thank you. Any further comments on this section? All right, information requests. Any comments with respect to section, what is labeled as section 11 will become section 10? Yes, Regent Shu.
Thank you, Chair Mayron. My concern is around the need to go through the board through OBR on all requests. It says specific request for information by a regent shall be made through OBR. While we try to do that, I don't think it's always practical to do it that way. And also there's the slowness, there's also a timing issue because, OBR may address the issue, but it may take longer than necessary to acquire the information, especially when something is happening like a board meeting. And I think it should maybe have a different word other than shall.
All right.
Is the way I would fix it.
All right. Any further input or comments on this section? Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just responding to that, I think that's a good question. My sense is, as a practical matter, I don't find this language offensive. Now, were it to be used to somehow try to suppress somebody having normal conversation in other settings or having the opportunity to find information in extraordinary circumstances, then I would think we would revisit it. But as it is right now, I think that this would be the general standard. There are practical issues, such as you're you're going to be the regent conferring degrees at the UMD commencement, and you have direct contact with the person organizing the event, and you call to say, what time should I be there and where should I park? It's a specific request for information, but it's obviously not coming through the board office. So even though shall is pretty strong language in most circumstances, I think the practical reality is that we would still have the ability to have that kind of communication. And were this ever used to somehow impugn a member of the board because they accessed information about a research station in a direct conversation, then I think maybe we'd revisit it. But other than that, I think I'm comfortable with the language that's been crafted.
All right. Thank you. Regents Figum?
Madam Chair, just there's two comments, and I'm not sure that how this works into this code or not. The first, some wise person once said, information is power. I don't know who that person was, but it was a quote that I'm aware of. It might have been Brian Steve's quote or something like that. But it was some wise person who said that, and information is power. There's no doubt about it. Two things, and this is, I don't think this can be written in any way, shape, or form, but I'm concerned sometime about my number of requests for information to board and to different departments. I think that I request a lot of things and it becomes a burden, a real overburden. I think that we as members have to understand the folks, whether it's Vice President Burnett or whether it's Julie Coniston or Vice President Bertelsen, they have jobs to do. And they just can't be responding to our requests all the time, even though we deserve and need that information. We can place an overburden on staff, including our own board staff, and I think we need to be recognizing of that. And the second thing, Madam Chair, is that when we do request information, I don't have a personal problem with that information being shared with all board members. I don't know if that's our policy or not, but if information is power and I request something about the budget, I got no problem with it being shared with everybody. Not just back with me. Now, those are two comments. I don't know if they relate directly to this or not, but the overburden of requests is a concern of mine on our personnel and our staff, and then the sharing of that information.
All right. Anything further? Yes, Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the language is pretty good on section 11. It gets to the issue of what may seem like excessive requests to one regent or a group and not to another has to be sorted out by a prioritization. And the language here about the president may seek guidance, I would do it from the board chair. I think the board chair has to referee it at that point. It should not come back to the full board. It's got to be, as a practical matter, the board chair should be, again, priority getting it done within the resources that are available for the staff and the priority that is.
Okay. Any other comment?
Madam Chair?
Yes, briefly, and then we're going to move on to section 11. It is already 9:05. We've now exceeded our 1 hour that I placed on this.
Thank you, and this is exceptional work, by the way. I greatly appreciate what's been done. This is substantial. Thank you to the board office as well. It seems that the language somewhat obviated this, but I am concerned, particularly because we actually have asymmetry in access to information. The board leadership obviously participates in a lot of conversations about matters of significance that the rest of us may or may not be a party to, and so it does become, for me, I'm concerned about passing judgment on requests for information sort of in the abstract this way. I think also the natural regulator on us is how much time we have and how much information we are able to digest and how much we want. And I put a lot of faith in my fellow regents in that they're requesting information that does have validity. And I would be very hesitant to ever judge someone else's desire for information as being, well, I generally consider it non-trivial. that someone's seeking certain information and would respect that they would have the right to that. To Regent Beeson's point, again, it's a practical conversation. I think that there is a practical impact that if the president says this request came in from somebody and it's going to take a ton of time and a ton of resources, a quick conversation with the chair may provide some guidance to avoid any kind of an opportunity for the entire board to make that determination. But I like this broader language about the board, and obviously we place certain expectations on our chair of the board. Because otherwise, if the board chair may be in disagreement with an individual member's desire for information, which would be a difficult circumstance for the board, it's going to end up in front of the full board anyway. And I think this just makes it clear that if a request ever is so burdensome that it would be on the risk, there'd be a prospect of denial of that request to a member of the board, I think it is a question for the entire board. You know, after 11 years and very different times, I've never seen a situation where a board member has been denied information. And so to some extent, it may be a solution in search of a problem. So I like the language as it is, but I do appreciate what Regent Beeson is getting at. And I think, again, as a practical matter, those conversations will probably avoid most of these issues having to rise to the board level.
All right. Moving on then to the last substantive sections, which is section 12, will become section 11, violation and breaches. Any comments or issues there? Yes, Regent Kenyatta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My comment, I'm not necessarily looking to spark discussion on this just now, but kind of as a follow-up to the conversation we had in review of this and some anecdotal things that have been said here, it seems like there's a lack of clarity on removal. And, you know, at the end of this section, we talk about sanctions, and you know, we had a conversation of, well, what is that and what's within our power? And that seems like a larger conversation and certainly not something we want to have to use, but I certainly am not clear on who has the power to do what or ask what of a regent in terms of sanctions or removal between this board and the legislature. So maybe too large of a conversation for now, but certainly something I think we should address before, on the front end.
All right, thank you. Any other comments with respect? Yes, Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I went back and forth on whether we should begin outlining what those tools are. I mean, clearly, one would be a censure. Second would be a recusal, and the third would be expulsion, and there's a question around that. Again, I think it depends on situation. I mean, I go toward the broader language at this point. The one thing I do feel more strongly about on this section would be whatever action the board should take should be a supermajority. It should not be, I mean, I throw out 75% of the board should be in line with whatever sanction we decide to take, and I don't know what the right number is, but it's got to be more than the 7 who bring an action, and I would propose something like 9 of the 12 as a supermajority, or whatever that action is, undefined at this point. But I think we shouldn't be debating the number of votes that it takes in the future. That's a principle we should be able to agree on now, instead of when we're in the midst of, if we are of a strong disagreement or strong issue.
All right, other comments? Regent Rocha?
Madam Chair, I apologize for the vigorous activity here. I agree with Regent Beeson on this. When you start talking about violations and breaches, in my military capacity, I spent a lot of time dealing with administrative procedure and sanction and remedy and so on. And in that case, I've got 2 federal titles that give authority to take specific action, 10 and 32. and it's not clear where our jurisdictional, and where we have the authority to execute a sentence on people. And so I was appreciative of the language that talks about impose sanctions as on the regent as it deems appropriate. The fact is, we can't prevent the board from passing a resolution. Right now, someone could move in second and to sanction Regent Smith for taking up 2 parking spaces in the parking ramp. And I mean, there's a second. So I mean, again, there are sort of these practical implications. I think that this is broad enough. And that if we ever ended up in that situation, the gentle person sitting at the desk right now would be very active with us in understanding what our capacities are and what risks there are, and do we now move this board into some sort of really unfortunate battle in the courts to determine what these things look like. And so, rather than shadowboxing every potential issue that may arise, I do agree with the principle that Regent Beeson just stated. I think that if the allegations themselves are not enough to sustain 9 of the members of the board to say we should take action against one of our members, just on the accusation before we even get into the fact-finding and establishment of fact, I don't think that we should be in the business of taking positions on our fellow board members, because it can move very quickly from difference of policy views to difference of desire to serve together. And so that would be the one thing I would prefer, that there is a larger threshold to reach the standard of bringing an action forward, but otherwise I think the language is sound. Thank you.
All right. Anything further? Yes, Regent Hurt.
Madam Chair, I'm happy to see some consideration for enforcement and holding us accountable to the policy. I'll follow up with you about my own personal comments, but I just want to be on the record that I appreciate this section.
Any further comments? All right, we will take your comments, review them, and we will be working on another draft. And the plan is to bring back a final draft for February. And I think one of the determinations we're going to have to make is whether we feel like we have enough information to present a final draft, or need to come back to you yet again to see language in light of the comments that have been made here and trying to address those concerns. So be having conversation with the board office about that. Obviously, my goal is to get this in place so we know how to conduct ourselves and have a finite policy to look at. With that, we're going to take a 5-minute recess, and then we will move to the issue of the renaming, policy on renaming. Thank you. This meeting is recessed. We are going to reconvene the Governance and Policy Committee meeting at this time. We are going to move to the next item on the docket, which is the policy framework regarding renaming. And I'm going to ask that President Gable, if you would like to kick this discussion off, and then we will, the whole purpose of this section of the agenda is for President Gable to educate us on what is out there, and what she is seeking is guidance from us. So this is a time period for you all to react to what it is she's presenting, the different policies that she has provided to us through the docket materials, so that she can get some direction from this board on where to go with naming and renaming. So with that, President Gable, let me turn this over to you.
Thank you, Chair Mayron, Vice Chair Hsu, members of the board. Good morning. Just to set the starting point, I'll remind everyone that last April, the board passed a resolution directing the administration to develop during the 2021 academic year in consultation with the board ongoing commemorations, educational activities, and/or permanent educational displays within or nearby one or more of these buildings, referring to the motion on the table at the time, to reflect the university's complex institutional history, to consider and recommend to the Board of Regents additional commemorations, educational activities, or markers across the system to promote reflection on the university's history, and, apropos to our discussion this morning, recommend revisions to the Board of Regents policy namings that establish clear principles and procedures to guide future renamings discussions. So you may recall that in our last meeting, we went through an overview of everything we intend to do underneath the fulfillment of this charge. We'll be bringing many things forward over the course of the time period indicated in the charge and beyond, because this isn't something that you necessarily finish. But in particular, we wanted to start the process to establish clear principles and procedures to guide future renamings discussions, to quote the language of the charge. So this today is the first of a three-part series of presentations related to establishing these clear principles and procedures to guide future renamings discussions. To this end, what we're doing for today is presenting 4 renaming frameworks for your consideration that I know you've had a chance to see and review in advance. These 4 are not everything that was available in the entire marketplace, if one could call this a marketplace, but they were from institutions that we respect and who have addressed similar challenges and have formed into a practice plan that fulfills a version of what this administration has been charged to do. So we thought they were useful as guidance. There's also the report of what we internally call the Coleman Committee report. Its official name was the final report of the President and Provost Advisory Committee on University History. I'll come back to that in a moment. So the 3 samples that we provided were from Yale, Michigan, and Stanford. And then we also provided the work done internally. I want to tell you just for 30 seconds a little bit about the Coleman Committee report. This report preceded the task force on renaming. It was a different work. It was done for the benefit of the president and the provost in order to have a deeper understanding. It was staffed differently than the task force. It was a precursor, a prequel, if you will, that included senior leaders, students, faculty, and staff across all 5 campuses, as well as the Alumni Association, UMF, and community members, and was chaired by Dean John Coleman, hence the name. And that committee also made a set of recommendations around guiding future renamings discussions. So we thought it was helpful, as good work done internally, to also include it as part of a point of reference in this discussion. So when we reviewed these samples and the previous work done within our own institution by our own stakeholders, there were many different ways we could go in trying to present this to you for the beginnings of a discussion. But some frameworks emerged that we thought would be helpful guideposts for the discussion in 3 primary areas. These frameworks are around the principles of inquiry, how we define ourselves in terms of what it is we hope to accomplish when addressing these questions. And you may notice that each of the institutions and our own pre-existing report approach this slightly differently. We'll discuss that. Each of these samples provide examples of how the governance question is addressed, and I would like to talk about that. By governance, I mean more around who is able to bring forth a request for renamings. And then, separately, each has some attention to how the research is done, how the decision is made, what information is relied upon, and how the institution goes about gathering that information. So those are frameworks for discussion that I suggest and that I would like for us to consider following. We could have more, or we could meander through this. Today is intended to be pretty open, gathering of information and input with these samples as just samples, guideposts. They are not intended to be part of a proposal. That would come after we have this conversation and any ensuing Q&A that comes after the meeting, with the intent that we would bring forth initial sample language at the next board meeting for additional discussion. So let's start with how we start to see these three framing considerations take shape. For example, in Michigan and in the Coleman Committee report, there are guiding principles that are really broad. Some are more focused on recognizing diversity and consistency. Some are more focused on historical preservation and interpretation. Some are very focused on the nature of change, which is a common debate, very deep debate in historical scholarly circles. Yale and Stanford, on the other hand, have very specific questions and points for consideration. They ask questions around things like affiliation and harmful impact, community identification, conflict with core mission, the strength of the historical evidence, the namesake's behavior in relation to their life as a whole, and the individual's legacy in their own time and now. Specifically, I'll call to your attention, Yale University offers 3 presumptions that highlight the importance of considering renamings under exceptional circumstances. The motion for renamings are least strong when they involve someone who made major contributions to the university, and the obligation of the university to ensure that a removal does not have the effect of erasing history. These are complicated. There is a reason why no best practice has emerged and why these discussions are extremely hard. As we look at these examples for inspiration, I think if we look at principles of inquiry, where we are most likely to see things begin to coalesce is around our guiding principles into the renaming framework, which is what Michigan did and what we see in the Coleman Committee report. Those guiding principles into the renaming framework from those 2 examples are not the same, but they both have them, and I think it's a good place to start from an organizational structure. We can ask ourselves, on the other hand, if we would rather shed both of those examples and have a more direct approach by presenting specific questions and points of consideration, the way Yale and Stanford have. Do we want a hybrid, or do we think the principles in both types of examples should be rejected and we should do something else altogether? So I'll pause there and see if there is any feedback on principles of inquiry or the frameworks to guide the discussion.
All right, let's open it up to discussion here and provide feedback, and any form of feedback I think will be helpful to President Gable and what she's trying to do here. So, Regent Davenport, looks like you were signaling you'd like to comment.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Marion, and I'll just open it up. Thank you for this research that was done on the other institutions, and I know there was more that might be behind this. I like the guiding principles. I envision almost, and it's kind of a rhetorical question, and because I'm not sure if one can put together some kind of a rubric. And I'll give you my markup of the policy, because I think there's a lot of good in here from which to put our policy together.
Just clarification, when you say a lot of good in here, meaning among all 4 policies or a particular policy?
I would say within each of them. I and actually was impressed by how far we have come in the University of Minnesota example, and there's a lot in there, I think, that recognizes the complexity of this. So I guess my comment would be, as we look forward, is there an opportunity, is it a right thing to put a rubric together with these guiding principles with some variation? And I would look to the experts here at the university system to do that. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to call on Regent Powell next, but before I do, let me just say, at any time, President Gable, if you have follow-up questions to a comment that's been made by a regent so that you make sure you understand where he or she is coming from, please interject and say that you want to do that. I want to make sure you're getting the information you need to give you the guidance you need.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
All right. With that, Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Mayron. Well, first of all, President Gable, thank you for the 4 examples, which I think were very different and very thought-provoking, and I just found it very helpful and stimulating to sort of read them, and it gave me maybe a little better appreciation for how difficult this is. I also think that the framing considerations that you put before us are very helpful, and so I'll give you. I mean, I guess you're looking for some thoughts and reactions. So I have to say that there were a number of, I guess we'll call them now principles of the inquiry, across the 4 that, and some of them we saw in more than one of them, which I thought were very powerful. And I'll give you a couple that really struck me. And one of them to me is sort of the principle of sort of approaching with caution and humility. And I think it was Michigan, the beautiful language. We should remember that it's very easy to blame those in the past for lacking the knowledge, wisdom, and values that we seem to possess today. And I thought that was helpful. I think that this idea that names remind us of our history, both all of our glories and our imperfections, and that no matter what we do, we can't erase our history. And I thought that also was a helpful principle. I thought that the notion of the centrality of behavior to an individual's life is also a good guidepost. And I think the last question I have is, it's not clear to me. Maybe it's clearer in the Yale example, but I think the factors that rise to a level of a renaming consideration is work to be done there. Mm-hmm. So anyway, a couple of thoughts.
Thank you.
All right. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with Regent Powell that the President's laid out some thought-provoking material here. In one way, I almost wish we, before moving ahead with our own policy, is working on this mitigation for the 3 buildings that we talked about earlier this year. I would like to see how that proceeds, how we in the community, the university community, the larger community feel about how that goes, because that may inform the policy itself. And we have 3 very specific situations that we've decided to keep those names on buildings, but we've also agreed that we need to recognize the imperfect history around their work at the university. And so until we have that complete, I'm hesitant about sort of jumping into final policy work. There's going to be some best practices here. They're going to keep emerging. The work that Dean Coleman's done is good. And the other universities, there's definitely material that we can pull out of there. But we do have work to do now with 3 buildings, and that should be a priority for this year.
All right, thank you very much, Regent Beeson. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It seems to me that there are a couple of things going on here. And when I've had a chance to participate in some of the dialogue with community members or university community members and students in particular, there has been an interest in there's an underlying interest in wanting the campus to reflect the world today. And part of the challenge with that when it comes to building names is these buildings last a very long time. And we don't build very many of them. And so to the extent that there have been people in the last decades who have made substantial contributions to the institution and to the world generally, there are very few opportunities to recognize those folks. And what I'm getting from people is a sense that they would like to see a more reflective mix of recognitions, which then leads into this conversation about unnaming buildings that have been named after people in the past. They're two very different questions, and the question that I ask is, shouldn't we perhaps consider a policy of renewal when it comes to namings? Because if the intent is really just to have an opportunity to rename some buildings, you kind of have to wonder whether there's going to be a particularly balanced or fair hearing in terms of the evaluation of people about whom buildings are named. And I feel like this is one of the reasons we ended up where we did not that long ago on this issue. The metaphor I would use, it's the reason why you don't want the judge who's sentencing the defendant to also own stock in a private prison. If you have a certain motivation for something to occur, it will color the way you evaluate the facts that are in front of you. So to me, it seems that if we were to have a conversation about when we may be leaders in the environment on this issue, to say maybe we have categories of buildings. We have legacy buildings like a Northrop or a Pillsbury on this. I'm talking Minneapolis, St. Paul campus specifically. But then maybe there are other buildings where we do a term of years, where after a certain number of years, you would have the opportunity then to name a building in recognizing somebody who's made a more recent contribution and one that would reflect the community more broadly. And in doing so, you would still preserve within that building the historical naming and an explanation of about whom or after whom it has been named and why. I thought about, well, there's a lot of cost in doing that, I think, at times when you would make those kinds of changes. But in the digital world, it's a lot less expensive than it would have been a generation or two ago. And we, ultimately could come up with ways of, mitigating those cost factors. But I would suggest that the cost of that is far lower than what this institution has been through in this dialogue. Now, once that's done, I think you still need to have an opportunity to make these evaluations for buildings that are, whether they're in the temporary, decades naming versus a permanent naming. And in that case, I would, my big focus in this is, and I noticed, I appreciate the materials that were provided, but I tend to be somewhat partial to the Stanford plan because it gave a very specific process for identifying facts, and which were not specifically included, but I don't think they were excluded from this dialogue. You just gave us a little synopsis of what's there. So to me, I really see this as two things. First, we address the fact that there is an appetite in the community for a university community that reflects the world today and acknowledges work that people have done in a more recent period when building namings don't really lend themselves to that because of the long time that a building remains and holds a name. I think that's one effort that I would very much like to see us explore, and then the other one would be then coming up with a very fair and deliberate process akin to what Regent Powell was talking about with that kind of language, with the specifics in a process that we can rely upon for ensuring that we are not heading down a road because we can, simply because we can, because I think that one of the harbingers of a just society is that we speak for those who can't speak for themselves, and it's hard to think of somebody who can't speak for themselves, much less than someone who's been gone for decades, if not centuries. And so I think fairness even to those who've passed is important. So that's my thing. I would like to see us address that. And then at the same time coming up with a policy to address these very important questions about the propriety of the names that we do bear. Thank you.
Yeah, just one follow-up, Madam Chairman. I just want to clarify, because in the consultation that we did that led to us organizing this discussion in the way that we have for you, there was also, there was discussion of those for whom the buildings were named being unable to speak, obviously, but there was also discussion of those who, during the history of that time or during that time period, had their voice suppressed, oppressed, or silenced, and were not able to speak. And I want to make sure we're talking about what we're talking about with that.
Madam Chair, if I can respond. I appreciate the concept, but they're really two different things. I don't think there's any question that anybody around this table would have a hard time empathizing, to the extent we're able, with people who were silenced, suppressed, oppressed at the time. So I don't think, that's not really in question. I think we can understand. It has to do with what the person really believed. Because when you place beliefs, and it has to be based on sort of subjective leaps and so on and so forth. Obviously, when someone has a written document where they say things, and this is what I believe about a race or miscegenation or whatever the case is, we know what they thought. But when you're saying, well, there was this action, they may or may not have been responsible for it, but from that we can conclude this is what they believe. Those are really difficult to do without being able to sort of interview the person and ask, well, what did this mean? What was your role? So again, I appreciate that there are a lot of people that were involved, but it seems to me that there's not a big question as to what the people who were oppressed and suppressed by this, by varying times and varying community standards. But it's making sure that we're not sort of convicting somebody as a way of holding somebody accountable for times that we would not find appropriate nowadays.
I'm sorry, Madam, just one more clarification, because this would really guide language, and so I really want to make sure I understand this, or proposed language is it around, there are components of the examples, and we see this in different ways in each of the four, that get at the person, how much of this was their whole life, how much of this was a decision in a context. There's language around that. There's also language in several of the policies around the impact of their actions, whether they realized that impact or not, consequences of their actions on communities that they may not have realized were being impacted by their decisions, even if those decisions were a small part of their overall belief system. And that is a point of inquiry. It would frame a question. I don't know that we need to decide that today, but I do think that's a very critical decision point around how the evaluation process occurs that we do need to probably on its own think about.
All right. Let's, the next person who indicated a desire to comment is Regents Swigum.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, President, I'm one in life who believes very, very strongly that we should not spend time, money, and resources reinventing the wheel. Now, the University of Minnesota is a special, unique, irreplaceable place and gift in life. We're special and we're awesome. I'm not opposed to being the Yale of the Midwest or the Stanford of the Midwest or even being in connection with our sister state of Michigan. I'm not opposed to that because they're pretty good institutions too. Thank you for sharing these 4 different examples with us. I'm just going to make, just from my own personal feeling, a couple of comments about, or one comment about each of them. First of all, I read all 4 of them, and I think I can put myself into support of almost all 4 of them. They read pretty good to me to have those principles. But in the Yale principles, the presumptions, I think, are really, really good and really important in the Yale principles, the 3 presumptions that they have there. In the Michigan principles, let me echo my friend, Mr. Powell, who shared that quote with me. I sometimes wonder why I'm so much more enlightened, so much smarter than my mother, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother were. And I don't think I am. I say that facetiously. I don't think I am. So I think the respect of those who've gone before us is very, very important. And in the Stanford principles, Madam President, when we look at the factors to be considered there in the Stanford principles, to understand that there's harm caused by maybe not renaming, but there's also potential harm caused by renaming. that's mentioned in those Stanford, or in those principles of Stanford, and I think that they have to be, that's a good balance to consider as we go forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Regent Shu.
Thank you, Chair Mayron. Thank you, Madam President, for bringing this information to us. You know, having gone through the last round of this, or the first round of this, I think I think we have a lot of lessons that we have learned from that, and that's maybe something that we should start with, because we actually do have experience in this area, having gone through it once before. We did not start by doing what we're doing now, which is maybe one of the lessons that we learned. I would say that there are various things in each of these policies that I would support. I did like the section that Regent Powell had quoted. I was going to do the same. And I do think that, you know, whatever we decide to do, we need to be committed to the search for truth and report on what we find, not just cherry pick the things that make a case look better or worse. I think we need to look to the descendants of these people who have had buildings named after them. I think we should primarily trust the board that was in place at the time, because this was their decision. And unless we find something that they didn't know, or something that we think they didn't know, we should probably kind of leave things as they are. I know a lot of people have desires to rename buildings just for the sake of renaming buildings, to either increase diversity or, you know, whatever their reasons are. But that's not a good enough reason for me, just to say, okay, it's a new day, we're gonna, you know, kind of like when governments are toppled, buildings and cities and all those things are renamed at that time. I don't think we're in that kind of world. I wouldn't promote that. But I do think that if we do go through this process again, and I know that there are cases that we uncovered by looking at our history the last time around, that, you know, where people might legitimately say, hey, look, I disagree with the views of this person that this person had back in the 1850s. Let's look at it. I think we should look at those things, but also in line with what Regent Swigum mentioned, I think we have a lot of other things we have to do at this university too, and we shouldn't spend too much time or money or effort unless there is a really significant issue that we have to resolve. And I might point out that in the Yale example, I think Yale actually renamed an entire college, if I'm not mistaken, Calhoun. Yeah, not just their policy seems to be more around a building, but I think they renamed their entire college, which is something that's interesting. And I know in our own examples, we have legal agreements with certain entities that have sponsored, you know, naming rights and all those things. And those, you know, obviously we may not always have a TCF stadium. We may have another, you know, after whatever it is, 2039, we may have another bank or another entity that's interested in purchasing that. And, you know, there are some people who have said we should have naming rights for every building so that we can raise money for the university. You know, as much as we need money, I'm not sure that's the greatest idea, but, you know, maybe we should look at that also in the policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Regent Hare. Regent Hare. You're next.
I thought you were.
No, we'll loop back to him after. Yep. I want to hear from everybody who hasn't spoken first, and then we'll come back.
Chair Mayron and President Gable, I do appreciate the research and thought that you put into this, and I think it's putting us on a really good start to do something that we said that we would do a while ago, and that the university community is looking for us to do something on, and just realizing, and I guess it was there's pros and cons that I was not here last March when you had the renaming issue. But I do know that the community is looking for us to to do what we said we were going to do, and that is to come up with a naming policy. And so I think this gives us a lot of consideration, and it's, I guess, good or bad to know that we are not the first to face this, that other places, other universities have faced this issue, and they've come up with some solutions and some best practices. And so I think going forward, yeah, just picking and choosing and developing a policy, which I think we're on the right path for. So thank you for your work on this.
All right, thank you very much. Regent Kenyana.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam President. This was very helpful material and timely. I think they were all relevant. They were also reflective of the actual institutions, if you looked at them. But I just have a few comments. But I do remember in maybe 2 months ago, Regent Davenport, Regent Maron, Regent Her and I were at Morris. We're walking around, and I think we're like, the science building is called the science building. And the library, I think, was called maybe okay, I don't know what buildings they were, but there were a couple of them, and we're like, that's pretty simple, but I was just...
You talked about the red building.
There was a few buildings, but I'll make a couple comments. There's kind of two of these principles that I want to pull out, because they're different from the others. I think overall, when you look at all of them, and just with how people in society think, the presumption is against renaming. And that's just my opinion. And what I've found is that there's two here, one from Michigan and one from us, the Coleman report, as we're calling it, that are interesting. One is the U of M one is change, and the Michigan one is interpretation. And the reason these stand out is because they kind of reflect how we look at everything else. We change things every day. We change policy, we change real estate, we change faculty, we change staff, we change budget. And the university does not look how it did, X years ago. Society does not look how it did X years ago, and so on and so forth. And with kind of to your point, Regent Rocha, people are looking for campus to reflect the world today. And if you step aside from renaming, we oblige to that on everything else, on student services, on budget, on facilities, on policies and whatnot, and they're evolving as things evolve. So, I just wonder why, I'm just wondering out loud why naming has been insulated and completely exempt from that kind of thinking that we apply to everything else. So I think you introduced an interesting concept of just continually changing and whatnot. That's pretty much what stood out for me, but I really like this quote on the U of M one, on the Coleman report, under change, and I'll just read that one sentence. We should not be incapacitated by the idea and actuality of change, including considering renaming long-standing building names. And I read that and replaced renaming with any other action we do, We should not be incapacitated by change, including changing policies, changing budget, changing real estate, adding a campus, removing a campus. We've done all that. Those two stand out to me in that they just approach naming the way we approach anything else. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I just have a point of clarification to ask you, Regent Kenyana. So did I hear that on the one hand you were saying you agreed with the presumption against renaming, and I certainly got your second point, or you were saying...
I recognized it, Madam Chair.
Pardon?
I recognize the presumption.
But you're not saying, but rather your focus would be, let's look at change the way we look at it in the broad context.
I think it's worth exploring, yes.
All right, thank you. All right, Regent McMillan.
My input here is a little out of time because I'm backing up to President Gable's interchange with Regent Rocha and her request for some clarity, and then I got a comment on a topic Regent Beeson brought up. But it seems to me that President Gable was also asking and looking for confirmation that we want focus on the victims of the act of what happened here. And in my, going back to the March timeframe, I thought one of the things, and there wasn't unanimous agreement about this, but the people impacted by not having access to the dorm. You know, back in the day, there was at least many members of the board that were like, well, we need to look at that too, and should we commemorate any of that? I believe it's very important that we do have a scope of inquiry as we do these things that looks at not only the perpetrator or alleged person who may have had may have had conduct that wasn't appropriate, but who did it impact? And I think the stories we tell and the memorializations we leave behind have to include that. So I'm not sure I captured what you were asking, but you and Regent Rocha had a little give and take there, and I had wanted to jump in then. So the affected people, students, faculty, staff, whoever it is, have to be part of our research inquiry too. And then on Regent Beeson, I'm maybe a little different sense here. I think he said that, and I'll paraphrase, want to get to the elements of the resolution the board passed that deal with what are we going to do with the buildings we chose not to rename before we finish the policy. Maybe I'm pretty interested in the policy because I think it was the lack of a policy that got us into the quagmire we're in many ways. So I'm perhaps a little more interested than Regent Beeson in advancing that, and commend the president for picking this up quickly and moving it forward without a framework and a policy by which we can go forward and address the next renaming request, whatever it might be, or the next renaming issue. I think as a former board chair, it's very, very difficult space to navigate. So I'd like the policy almost first, but I'm not super strong about that. I just think without one, it's very difficult space to navigate.
Thank you. Are there a couple regions who wanted to speak again, Ben, before we do that? I just want to, from President Gable, I think you divided up your inquiry here with us into a couple segments, and I think right now we're in the segment of talking about principles of inquiry, trying to get guidance on it. I know you want guidance on these other considerations as well. So, and I told you we're going to give you what time you need, but I want to make sure you get adequate time. And am I correct that we also you want guidance on these other considerations?
That's correct, Madam Chairman.
All right. So with that, I know that both Regents Powell and Regent Beeson would like to say something again. My question is, do you feel, I don't know if compelled to do that now, or could we move on to these other sections so we can give guidance to the president on them as well?
I can pass.
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. All right, President Gable, do you want to frame the next issues?
Thank you, Chair Maron. All right, the second area of inquiry is around shared governance. Not so much oversight, because of course, ultimately, this is a board policy, but how we create the inquiry or the framework to determine who can be involved in bringing the renaming inquiry. The consensus across the policies broadly is framing around the university community. You see language like that in one way or another fairly consistently. For example, the University of Michigan describes this as any member of the university community, student, faculty, staff, alum, or university organization, but that only members of this community can make the request. Who should be able to make a renaming request is ultimately a question that I think we need to resolve. There's also some consistency that renaming requests should engage the principals and make a case rather than simply be able to pose the question. And should the established principles serve as the basis for that case? And so I would like to posit that for your consideration. Thank you.
All right. Focusing on that particular consideration, any reaction or guidance that you can provide to President Gable?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Regent Rocha.
Thank you. I find the standards that they have applied to be fair. I think if there's someone outside of the university community, broadly defined, we're a fairly enormous community with assets and personnel across the state, and if some third party wants to and they can't find somebody within the university to share their concern and bring it forward, I would find that to be quite surprising. So I don't think that that's an inappropriate standard that would exclude other constituencies from having access to this process, and so I would support what has been done by our peers.
Regent McMillan?
I would as well, with the added caveat that I think a request has to be more than, just a one-off, boy, wouldn't it be nice? There's got to be some real work put in and some real basis to it, some threshold, and I don't know which of our peers has done that best, but I agree with everything Regent Rocha just said about the community and where the inquiries can come from, but it's got to be real and significant and worthy of the administration and the board and the resources, to Regent Swigham's point, that we'll spend looking at it.
And seeing some nodding of the heads, affirmative agreeing with the comments that were made by, just made by Regent McMillan, which build on the comments by Regent Rocha. So again, in the spirit of time, if people are generally in agreement with those comments, we can move on to the next consideration. If people have a different way of thinking or want to provide a different set of thoughts or considerations, please do so at this time. Otherwise, we'll let President Gable move on to the next area of consideration.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Maron.
Gable.
Thank you. The third decision we've called research. I'm not sure that was necessarily the way to entitle it. The question is really, how does the university convene the group that reviews the renaming requests? For example, at Stanford, the president may begin the process of reconsidering the name on a building or another feature at his or her own initiative, or in response to a well-considered request submitted by the university community, as per our previous conversation. Upon receipt of the request, the president may make further inquiries to its submitters and, in his or her discretion, submit a petition to a committee appointed ad hoc by the president and the provost to investigate claims, and then report back. Similarly, at Michigan and Yale, the president can charge a committee to examine specific proposals. The recommendation from the Coleman Committee report supports the establishment of a permanent committee that considers renamings in addition to broad institutional historical complexity and other activities beyond renaming that are related to being a public institution with a public history. So ultimately, I think the two questions for consideration are, should the president, at their discretion, refer a petition to a committee which reports back to the president, or should a permanent committee be established that reviews this work when renamings request comes in, but is also standing for review of other institutional history efforts? I should mention, for clarity to the board, we could establish a permanent committee, and we have many committees, as you all know, on the university campus that just exists for institutional history, and the task force suggested that, and we have that under consideration right now. But that would be more for things that are not for board purview, educational programs, curriculum, and things that relate to the academic affairs and of the institution. The question would be whether this entity or an additional entity would also be the standing committee presumed to be in place to provide the feedback when a renamings petition comes in. So I'll pose that for your consideration.
And let me just ask a point of clarification, and others of you may know the answer to this, but it appeared from reading the Coleman report that what they were talking about is they were identifying actually two different committees, one that already exists that I may have it wrong, the honors committee or something like that, that addresses namings. And then they were talking about a separate committee, permanent standing committee, that would address renamings and other institutional broad issues, if I understood their report.
I believe that to be correct, Madam Chair. There is a committee on namings. You receive reports from them and recommendations and advice from them when any naming issue is presented. They do not, because we do not have policy on this, directly consider renamings. That's not their purview. So the question would be whether we stand up an ad hoc committee to do the work that we need when a legitimate renamings request, as per the methodology described in the policy, arises, or whether we make this a part of the function of a permanent committee.
For example, the committee that already exists on naming.
Or a different,
Or a different
yes,
committee.
that is around institutional history that may or may not include namings.
All right, thank you. So with those comments in mind, Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think my initial reaction is to keep the namings committee as it is constituted with the work that it's doing. But the renaming is really a very different sort of issue. An option for the renamings is to have a board committee. You know, I think one of the issues was that I think we would do better in this case, and it's an unusual structure, but to have the board and the faculty work together on this at the beginning on these issues. So, so I don't know if it's a board committee or the board's represented on that committee, but there's just a lot of sensitivity and there's a lack of trust, I think, obviously directed toward the board on how, we handle this. And there's some trust the other way or just tension. And that we can start working together on this. I think I just wouldn't want to see a committee get constituted and then, there being a total miscommunication on sort of where this sort of ultimately ends up. So it's an idea.
Great. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would concur with Regent Beeson's comments and building off of my prior conversation about this kind of two separate issues we're talking about. The Namings Committee has a pretty well-defined role. In fact, we have material in front of us today, if I'm not mistaken, on their work. And that's that. The concern about my concern about establishing a permanent committee in this regard is it shifts the presumption. When I was, I don't know if it was poli-sci 1037 at this very institution, the politics of the Bureau. If you create a Bureau, the Bureau will find something to do. There's a presumption that there is something in that case, as opposed to setting up a committee when someone, as Regent McMillan, I think so aptly put, brings a case with some work behind it, then we have the capacity. I would hope that this is not, that we don't sort of discover that we have this consistent challenge, but when it does arise, I think that it would then warrant setting something up. Again, from my perspective, I would prefer that we would set up perhaps a committee now to talk about looking at a refreshment, because there's a vast difference between coming up with an objective rule that's predictable and it doesn't carry the same. I don't know that you necessarily have to besmirch a legacy to create a renaming opportunity. And right now, the only way that we would renew would be to come up with a way of identifying shortcomings and people who, for their time, may have made contributions, but also took actions that we don't find acceptable in the current time. So I think that coming up with an objective way, setting up a committee to looking at our building stock across all campuses and identifying different categories of buildings that may give us some opportunity, putting that energy into the positive impact that people have had on the campus, rather than being compelled to find the shortcomings to have those opportunities to then recognize those positive impacts, I think is a better use of our institutional energy and address the fact that there is an appetite for this right now that I don't think existed in years past, and I think it's perfectly appropriate and consistent with Regent Kenyana's comments. It's something we should explore. So, for dealing with the specific issues of the actions and so on of an individual, I think that ad hoc and perhaps even within the context of what Regent Beeson said, where you have this better coordination, so we're not kind of. Everybody was sort of surprised at the surprise, right, that the board hadn't really been part of that dialogue up until that point. And so I think what he's describing could avoid that in a case-by-case basis. But I still would like us to take a longer view. So thank you.
Thank you. Regent Kenyana.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam President. My microphone is broken. My apologies.
You're good.
I was just going to say that it's my understanding, this is board policy and would therefore apply across the system. So I'd seek clarification on then how the committee would apply. You know, if you do the one standing committee, it could be system-wide, but then you have to be intentional about the makeup of it, or would it make more sense to then ask each of the campuses to then, you know, find ways to comply and maybe create their own committees? So I just want to make sure we're mindful of that.
Regent Shu?
Thank you, Chair Maron. I may have answered this question already before, but I believe that we should not have a permanent committee. We should just deal with issues as they come up in a temporary, name a committee when you need to name a committee. I also believe that, you know, unless we find something significant, then really there is nothing to do unless someone comes forward with some information that it was not known before. So let's leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Regent McMillan?
Thank you, Chair Maron. I agree with earlier commenters that we not expand or redefine the work of the role of the Namings Committee. And I'm also very in agreement with Regent Beeson that the communication with and among the faculty and the board is vital, and I want to do everything we can to appreciate and understand where they're coming from, so we, you know, build trust and build what is a good relationship, but around this issue is challenged. And in that regard, President Gable, and you don't have to answer this now, but I'm concerned about establishing a new committee, but I'm not opposed to it, but I'm very interested in what does the faculty and the staff and the administrative leadership of this organization think about the merits of that before we do it, and get us some more input on that, because if a new standing committee isn't in their interest either, then I certainly don't want to do it. My instincts are not to go that route, but if their interest is in having one, I want to understand and know that. So that a little more feedback on that would be helpful.
Regent Davenport?
Thank you, Chair Maron. Not having been an active participant in the last recent conversations and piggybacking on Regent McMillan's, my tendency is to leave the control of committees and designations and the charge to the president. And that's where I would be on that.
Any other comments? I would just like to make one comment as it relates, this is me speaking personally, as to the naming committee, the committee currently charged with namings. I'm hearing that there's a desire to keep them separate, but, and I don't know enough about what they do or the considerations that they take into account with naming, but I think that there has to be absolute coordination and collaboration between the kinds of issues that we are going to guide renaming, to me, have to be thought about and considered intentionally with respect to any naming. And so I want to make sure that the left hand and the right hand are in sync as much as they can be, because those naming issues may become somebody else's problem decades down the road. And I just think we need to have collaboration. We need to attend to what they're doing as well. I recognize that isn't part of the charge here. Your charge is to address renaming, but I think we have to, it has to touch on what the naming committee is doing as well. All right, with that, any other considerations, President Gable, that you would like to raise, or any other input you would like to get at this time?
No, thank you, Madam Chair, that this is extremely helpful, and we can work from this to to synthesize these remarks into proposed language for discussion at our next meeting. But I also would be, I suppose item 4 on this list that we didn't overtly state would be, is there anything else that you saw in the policies or from the experience of this group that you think should be taken into consideration in the development of the proposed language that we would bring forward in February?
All right, well, certainly if people have things come to mind, sharing that information with President Gable, I know will be helpful to her.
Thank you.
All right, then with that, that concludes the Governance Committee. I can just end it, or do I need a motion? I need a motion to conclude the meeting. And there's a second, all in favor? Opposed? This meeting of the Governance Committee and Policy Committee is adjourned. Thank you.